The summer of the late 1880s had settled over the Texas Panhandle like a sheet of heated zinc, relentless and blinding. In the small, scarred town of Red Butte, perched precariously on the fringe of the Llano Estacado, the dust was less a nuisance and more a permanent feature of existence, mixing with sweat to form a fine, stinging paste. Every object, every window pane, every man and woman seemed coated in the same tired ochre film. Lila Mae Hart knew that dust better than most. It clung to the hem of her simple calico skirt, settled on the chipped porcelain of the plates she scrubbed, and even managed to infiltrate the tepid, salty water drawn from the town's only reliable well. She was 22, though the sun and worry had etched lines around her eyes that suggested 28. She worked from dawn until the last drunk ranch hand stumbled out, washing dishes at Widow Alvarez's dusty water stop and cantina. Lila's immediate goal was survival, plain and simple, a goal complicated by one inherited treasure, a patch of hardscrabble earth right outside the town limits. About 40 acres of wind-burnt yucca and mesquite. It was worthless to most, but her mother had left it to her, an anchor in a world of drift, her deepest, most secret goal. However, was written not in the red dirt but in the lines of her own palm. Unreachable and vital, she desperately needed to learn to read and write. Without letters, she was tethered to the whims of the literate, blindfolded in a game of legal maneuvers and paper power. She needed to master the alphabet to master herself. The cantina was busiest whenever the monthly train, a loud, soot-spitting intrusion, blew its whistle once near the bend to drop off cargo and mail. Today, the smoke had just cleared, and a new kind of trouble had drifted in on the wake of the locomotive Silas Crowley. Crowley was a man of cold, starched collars and clean, pale hands. He owned the largest grazing lease north of town, and more significantly, he was the elected county clerk. This dual role power over cattle and power over paper made him Red Butte's uncontested overlord. He rarely raised his voice, preferring the dry, rustling authority of legal forms and ledgers. He employed Voss, a blocky man with perpetually bruised knuckles and the low, heavy intelligence of a battering ram, to handle any situation where paper failed to intimidate. Lila was on the porch, hauling the final bucket of brackish well water. When the trap was sprung, she needed a few dollars to pay the monthly levy for the water usage, the amount that kept her tiny land titles safe from being defaulted for public debt. She had been late last month, and the widow Alvarez had warned her that Crowley had been asking about her property. Crowley was waiting in the shadows of the county building next door, clean as a newly pressed stamp. Voss stood beside him, shoulders crowding the doorway. "Miss Hart." Crowley's voice was too smooth for the dusty street. "Timely, as ever. I was just reviewing the docket for your water obligation." Lila felt the familiar clench of fear in her stomach. "I have $2, Mr. Crowley. It should cover the levy." "Oh, it will. For the levy." Crowley reached inside his breast pocket and withdrew a folded, officially looking document. "But there is also the matter of the new well assessment. This property, your land, benefits from the new pipeline installed 3 miles north, which technically increases the value of your asset. You owe a small fee to the Red Butte Improvement Fund." Lila swallowed the grit on her tongue. "I did not hear about an improvement fund. It was posted in the courthouse window. Perhaps you missed it." He smiled, a thin, meaningless stretch of the lips. "No matter. The paperwork is quite clear. Just a simple formality." He tapped the paper. "Acknowledge the debt and the service, and we'll call it even for the next 3 months. It's an auction of debt. Really, if you acknowledge, you keep it out of the public domain. Saves you a headache, Miss Hart." Lila's heart hammered against her ribs. An auction of debt. She understood debt. She understood auctions. What she did not understand was the close printed script filling the page. She saw the familiar spot marked with an X, and she assumed, terribly, that this was simply the formalized receipt for her water payment, a receipt she had to make official because she couldn't sign her name. "You just put your mark here, Lila May," Voss prompted, his voice low and impatient. He was holding a small ink pad, the kind used for official seals. Lila felt the pressure of their eyes, the pressure of the heat, and the heavy weight of her own ignorance. To refuse might be to admit she was refusing payment, which meant losing the land now. To agree, she hoped, meant buying 3 months of peace. She licked her lips, tasted salt and fear, and pressed her thumb firmly onto the cool, damp ink pad, then onto the spot marked X. It was a dark, definitive seal against the white of the paper, a seal she had no way of breaking, no way of understanding. She thought she was signing a water receipt. She was, in fact, signing an involuntary transfer of the equity in her land to Crowley's improvement fund, conditional upon non-payment of the new, impossible fee. She wiped the ink off her thumb with the edge of her skirt, trying to appear nonchalant, as if she knew exactly what she had just done. It was at that precise, small moment of disaster that Eli McCrae rode into Red Butte. He wasn't heading for the county clerk's office. He was heading for the widow Alvarez's establishment for the simple necessities of life, coffee and rest. Eli was a man of long distances, a guide and drover, comfortable with the vast, quiet expanse of the high plains. He carried the quiet competence of a man who had seen too much early in life, a former Civil War communications courier who had learned the hard lessons of silence, observation, and the necessity of literacy in a world run by orders and dispatches. He was broad-shouldered but lean, dressed in serviceable leather that matched the rich, dark sheen of his horse. He had principles that he kept like good saddle leather honor boundaries. Keep your word. And if a person is truly weak or cornered, you protect them. But you do it with surgical precision, not with a swinging spectacle. Eli pulled his mount to a stop, the horse's long shadow falling across the dusty boardwalk, perfectly positioned to observe the transaction taking place without being directly involved. He watched the girl with the exhausted eyes press her thumbprint onto the paper. He watched the self-satisfied curl of Crowley's lip. He saw the cold triumph in the paperman and the silent, quick movement of the ranch girl. It was a tableau of exploitation, and it was older than the territory itself. Eli did not dismount, did not shout, did not even move his hand toward the well-oiled revolver on his hip. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his vest, pulled out a flat, worn pouch of chewing tobacco, and found the stub of a pencil nestled beside it. As Crowley folded the paper with a proprietary snap, Eli quietly, meticulously copied the long, faint serial number visible at the bottom edge of the document onto the soft, light brown leather of the tobacco pouch. The pouch was his personal ledger, his map, his secret notebook, a symbol of silent knowledge in a loud, illiterate world. Lila May jerked her hand back from Crowley, her face burning with the shame of the act. She felt the heavy, unspoken judgment of her illiteracy hanging in the air. She just wanted to flee the presence of the paper and the men who wielded it. She grabbed the folded document, which Crowley had negligently slid across the counter, and bolted, her only thought to get back to the clatter of the cantina kitchen where the sounds drowned out the thoughts. She ran past Eli's horse, startling the animal slightly. In her haste and agitation, the folded document slipped from her grasp and fluttered down into the fine, white gypsum dust of the road. Eli dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and he picked up the paper without unfolding it, keeping his gaze steady on the girl. She stopped 10 feet away, frozen in place, watching him hold the evidence of her failure. Eli walked toward her, and the setting sun caught the dust-mote-filled air, giving his face a reddish glow. The man who had just observed a quiet act of tyranny now stood holding its legal proof. He held out the paper, and Lila reached for it tentatively. Before he released it, he spoke, his voice low and rough, like sandpaper on dry wood. It was a simple question, but it landed with the weight of an accusation. "Do you know how your name is spelled on paper?" "Miss Hart." Lila May Hart stared at the fold of the document. Then at the man's steady, blue eyes, her cheeks, already flushed from the heat and shame, grew scarlet. She could feel the stares of a few idle men near the saloon. This was the core of her misery, laid bare in front of a stranger. She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. The single syllable was trapped somewhere in her throat, a dry, embarrassing confession. Eli simply nodded, tucking the tobacco pouch back into his vest pocket, the faint pencil markings a secret between himself and the leather. The whole encounter had the flavor of the town dry heat, salty water, and the knowledge that everything important was determined by forces you could not see or read. The well, that singular source of life, had become the tool of her subjugation. The dust that covered everything symbolized the fog of her ignorance. The tobacco pouch with its numbered note was the only secret seed of a clue. The few loafers who had witnessed the thumbprint incident were already chuckling. "Crowley got that little girl to point again," one man called out, his voice thick with mean amusement. "The fool doesn't know her way out of a paper bag." Lila felt a familiar wave of hopelessness. She snatched the paper from Eli's hand, careful not to touch his skin, and hurried into the shade of the cantina. Widow Alvarez, a stern woman with a good heart and eyes that had seen everything from saloon fires to land fraud, met her at the kitchen entrance. "He got you to sign another one, didn't he, child?" the widow asked, not unkindly, but with a weary finality. Lila just nodded, tossing the paper onto a shelf before grabbing a dishcloth. "You have to be careful with that man, Lila May. He likes to choke out the little lights in this town. He uses that ink and paper like a rope. You have your mother's land, and that's why he's after you. He wants it because the talk is the railroad will be buying up right-of-ways along the line next year. I paid the levy," Lila insisted, scrubbing a plate too hard. "I think it was just a receipt for the improvement fund." The widow snorted, a deep, knowing sound. "There is no improvement fund that benefits anyone but Silas Crowley. Just leave him alone. Child, don't antagonize him. Keep your head down." Keep your head down. That was the philosophy of Red Butte. Survive the drought, survive the men, survive the letters you could not read. Eli McCrae walked into the cantina shortly thereafter. He ordered coffee, sitting at the counter, his back to the wall, surveying the room with an almost clinical stillness. Lila avoided his gaze, scrubbing harder, wishing he would leave so she could regain her composure. He did not look like the kind of man who belonged in Red Butte for long. He was too controlled, too sharp around the edges. He waited until the midday rush had passed, the clang of the new train having faded to a faint echo. Lila was standing by the large, hot water sink, her face damp with steam and sweat, when he approached the kitchen door, politely stopping short of entering her domain. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was steady and quiet, cutting through the usual hum of the kitchen. Lila looked up, her expression a mixture of fatigue and suspicion. "That paper you signed outside," he continued, speaking plainly. "It was not a receipt. It was a mortgage note, a conditional one, based on a fee you will not be able to pay in 30 days. It is fraudulent in its purpose, if not in its construction." Lila's hands, still slick with soap and water, clenched the edge of the sink. Her eyes, the color of dusty river stones, were wide with immediate, sharp terror. The widow Alvarez had stepped away to count her till this was just between them. You read it." "I saw enough of it, and I read the serial number on it. I'm good at reading small details. Miss Hart, it's what keeps me and my drovers from walking into canyons." He paused, his gaze softening from analytical to something compassionate, yet practical. "You can fight the man, but you cannot fight the paper." Lila felt the shame return, sharper this time, carrying the cold sting of fear for her land. "Then I will lose it. I cannot fight what I cannot see." "That is the truth of it," Eli agreed, his tone entirely devoid of pity, offering only blunt, shared reality. He took his hat off, a gesture of respect, and smoothed back his hair, which was the color of faded straw. He then posed the question that would change the course of her life, a question that was not a challenge, but an invitation, placing the power back into her hands. It was the crucial turning point, the hinge upon which her deepest, unspoken desire was made visible. "If someone offered to teach you, Miss Hart," Eli McCrae asked, his eyes holding hers steady, "if someone offered to show you how your name is spelled, and how to spell that word mortgage, so it would never blindside you again, would you be willing to learn? Would you accept the trouble of the lessons?" Lila May Hart stared at him. She saw the dust on his boots, the strength in his quiet hands, and the clear intelligence behind his eyes. She saw the man who could read the maps of the stars and the maps of the law, offering her the tools to fight not with a fist, but with a pencil. In her eyes, a lifetime of humiliation and the desperate, bone-deep yearning for self-possession warred fiercely. The shame was vast, but the hunger for knowledge was deeper, a subterranean river running beneath the arid surface of her life. She did not answer with a word, but her gaze, though still weighted with suspicion, held a flickering, fierce spark of kismet. Eli saw the sudden stark light of hope ignite in the red desert of her gaze. She was waiting for the next step. Eli McCrae stepped back from the kitchen doorway, letting the steam of the dishwater settle. He did not press. He only waited, allowing Lila May Hart the space to wrestle with the proposition he had laid at her feet. It was a trade of skills, a careful calculus of need and expertise, but to Lila, it felt like a leap across a gorge she had always feared. She wiped her hands fiercely on her apron, the cheap, thin cotton already stained with grease and dust. Her first instinct was to run, to retreat into the safe, numb world of scrubbing and silence. The shame of her illiteracy was a deep, aching wound, and she was terrified of exposing it, of having her clumsiness with a pencil mocked by the one man who had seen her at her weakest moment. Why she finally managed, the single word, raspy, "Why would you men like you don't stop for girls like me?" Not for letters. Eli leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked tired, the dust of a long trail ingrained around his collar. "Men like me have learned that paper is a better weapon than a pistol," he said, his eyes steady. "I have seen lives ruined by one line of ink, and I have seen lives saved by one line of honest printing. It is an imbalance that costs blood in this territory. And you need to save your land. Miss Hart, you need to know exactly what Silas Crowley wrote about you and your mother's property." He gestured vaguely toward the hay barn, a large, weathered structure owned by the widow Alvarez, with a small, unused shed attached. "My drovers and I will be passing through for the next few weeks, staging before the big drive north. I need reliable meals cooked, not just what the widow can spare. I need rawhide tallowed and rigging checked. You have a reputation for being thorough, even if you're scrubbing someone else's mess." He laid out the contract. "I propose a barter. You cook the evening meal for 5 men, and you take the time each afternoon to strip and repair the leather gear that needs it. In exchange, I spend 1 hour with you, 5 days a week, teaching you the alphabet, the phonetic sounds, and how to structure a proper legal name." He straightened, making the terms physical. "We will use the porch of that empty shed. It's out of sight of the main street, and it catches the afternoon shadow. We start after the hottest part of the day, and we cease as soon as the sun dips below the western ridge. No exceptions. If you break the rule, if you refuse to try a lesson, if you run away, if you allow yourself to be distracted, the lesson stops for the day. If I break the rule, if I am disrespectful, if I touch you without your express consent, if I move the lesson indoors, the entire arrangement ceases, and I pay you for your cooking in gold coin." It was the rule about not touching that settled the swirling anxiety in Lila's chest. It recognized her as vulnerable. Yes, but it also recognized her dignity and drew a hard, clear line that the men of Red Butte rarely respected. It was a promise, as solid as the rock foundation of the cantina. "Outside," Lila echoed, looking toward the shed. "And before dark." "Exactly," Eli confirmed. "Out in the open, where the wind can see us, and where we won't invite gossip. This is not a social call. This is a transaction of necessity." Lila nodded, slowly at first, then firmly. The fear was still there, a knot in her throat, but the actual tangible chance to gain the power Crowley used against her was overwhelming. "I'll hold up my end. Mr. McCrae, you give me the letters. I'll give your men the meals and the leather." The agreement was sealed not with a handshake, but with a brief, intense look of shared purpose. The next afternoon, the late sun was starting its slow, agonizing drop toward the horizon, bathing the western walls of the shed in a muted, warm light. Lila May walked out to the porch, carrying not a basket of laundry, but a small, heavy sack of kindling for the fire and a bundle of dried rawhide thongs. Eli was already there. He had upended a dusty wooden water barrel to serve as a makeshift desk. The blackboard was the side of a large, flat packing crate, meticulously dusted and leaned against the shed wall. In his hand, he held a piece of chalk, thick and white against his tanned fingers. Lila was stiff, feeling every muscle in her back tense with apprehension. She glanced nervously toward the main road, afraid of who might pass by. Eli sensed her discomfort. "The men are out checking the herd markers," he murmured, keeping his voice low. "The widow is napping. There is only the dust and me. Miss Hart." "Just Lila," she corrected automatically, then regretted the intimacy of the name. "Just Eli, then," he replied, and the concession felt like the quiet turning of a lock. He tapped the makeshift board with the chalk. "We begin where every trail begins. At the start, the ABC of the world." He wrote the first letter, a capital A, a perfect triangle with a crossbar, slow and deliberate, the sound of the chalk a dry scratch that seemed loud in the afternoon stillness. He did the same for B, a column supporting two small, full sacks. And then C, the simple, open curve of a new moon. "These are the shapes," Eli instructed. "A is for apple, B is for bear, C is for cat. But for you, they are A for your ambition, B for your backbone, and C for the courage it takes to sit here." Lila looked at the letters. They were not just squiggles, they were architectural marvels, clean and definite, unlike the blurred, smudged ink on Crowley's documents. "Now," Eli said, stepping aside, "the most important letters you will ever learn, the ones that name you." He dipped the chalk, his concentration absolute, and wrote the letters LilamaeHart. He made them tall and broad, each stroke certain and proud. Lila May stared. She had seen her name written on forms, always small and hurried. Next to an X, she had heard it spoken 1,000 times, sometimes kindly, sometimes in derision, but she had never truly seen it. The arrangement of those 9 letters, solid and definite, defining her existence on the face of that weathered wood, hit her with a sudden, unexpected force, a wave of emotion, a mix of profound sadness for all the lost years and triumphant wonder, tightened her throat. "Is that me?" she whispered. "That is you," Eli confirmed, his voice gentle. "It is the sound of you, captured and held in place. It is your mark, your brand, and your signature. That'll at the start. That's your first letter. It's got a solid base and a strong vertical line. It will hold up anything you need it to." He handed her a small, worn piece of pencil, shortened by years of use until it was just a blunt stub. It was a comfortable, heavy weight in her palm. The pencil was worn thin, a symbol of growth achieved through persistent effort. "Now, you make that L," he said. "Don't worry if it looks like a busted fence post. Just make the shape." Lila's hand was shaking so badly from nerves and years of hard labor that the pencil felt alive. She pressed the point onto the wooden barrel top, and the resulting line was pale, wobbly, and almost invisible. She scrubbed it out quickly with her thumb, embarrassed. Hold on," Eli chuckled, a dry, low sound. He reached for his tobacco pouch and pulled out a small, folded piece of thick, soft cotton. He wrapped it around the pencil stub, creating a wider, more stable grip for her hand. "Your hand is used to scrubbing, not writing," he explained. "It needs retraining, but we all make mistakes. Lila, don't fear them. They are where the learning happens." He then gave her a brief, unexpected moment of self-deprecating humor. "You know, when I was a boy, learning to write orders during the war, I thought the word sarsaparilla had an I in it. Sarsaparilla. I wrote it that way on supply lists for 3 years. 3 years of the camp getting the wrong tonic. Everyone laughed, but the world didn't end, and I finally got it right. Mistakes are old friends of mine. Greet them kindly, and they will teach you a trick or two." Lila laughed then, a small, genuine puff of sound that felt strangely liberating. The big, serious man making light of his own long-ago folly made her feel safer. She tried again, pressing harder, moving her whole arm, not just her wrist, a vertical line, then a horizontal footing. It wasn't perfect, but it was there. She had made the L. Over the next few days, the porch became their classroom. The rhythm of the lessons quickly integrated with the rhythm of the cantina. Lila would spend the morning preparing dried beans and cornmeal, then the early afternoon scrubbing. By 3 o'clock, she would be out on the porch with Eli. She discovered her mind was sharper than she had given it credit for. She had a good memory for shapes and sounds, and the simple structure of the alphabet began to feel like the logic of a good trail map. One afternoon, they were practicing the letter M for mother. Eli had said. Lila's mind wandered to the single piece of paper she held most dear, a worn, stained letter from her mother, written shortly before she died. Lila kept it hidden inside a small, worn cloth pouch, tied with a simple twine. She often unfolded it in private, tracing the looping, elegant script, knowing the message was sealed away from her, just another symbol of her powerlessness. "Are you looking at the horizon?" Lila Eli asked, jolting her back to the present. She shook her head. I have a letter from my mother. I just wonder what it says. I wonder if she was proud." Eli understood immediately. "We'll get to it. We need to walk before we can run a message." The quiet concentration they shared began to attract subtle notice. One evening, as Eli was erasing the day's work, the short words, "hat, bat, cat," from the wooden board. Voss strode past, heading toward the saloon. He stopped abruptly, his hulking frame filling the walkway, casting a long, intimidating shadow. He looked at the chalk dust, then at Eli, then fixed his small, aggressive eyes on Lila, who was carefully gathering her stub of a pencil and the cotton grip. "Well, looky here," Voss sneered, his voice oily and rough, the big drover playing schoolmarm with the dish rag girl, trying to teach her to read the labels on the whiskey bottle. "McCrae!" Eli didn't flinch. He remained where he was, calm and still. "Just making sure my meals are prepared right. Voss, no more, no less." "Crowley don't like people reading around here," Voss said, his tone turning into a low threat. "Makes the county clerk nervous. Smart folks ask too many questions about the lines on the map." "Then Crowley should hire better clerks who can draw cleaner lines," Eli retorted simply, his eyes meeting Voss's with a steely indifference. "And I am not employed by Crowley. I am employed by the trail. Now, get on with your drink. Voss, the sun is setting, and the lesson is over." Voss glared, his face contorted in a sneer, but he knew he couldn't start a physical fight over a school lesson without drawing the widow's wrath, or, worse, admitting to Crowley that he was worried about a woman learning her letters. He spat a curse into the dust and lumbered away. The small skirmish left Lila shaken, but Eli's cool defense gave her a fierce dose of pride. He hadn't fought with violence, but with wit and solid logic. "See there," Eli murmured, returning to the porch. "Letters give you armor. You stand straighter when you know your footing." Her internal motivation solidified. She was no longer just learning to defend her land. She was learning to shield herself from the heavy hands of men like Voss, who relied on her ignorance. The lessons continued, each day bringing new challenges and small, triumphant moments. Eli introduced vowels, explaining the open, breathing sounds of A, E, I, O, U, the sounds of life itself. He used objects around them, a stone, the gate to the pasture, the dust beneath their feet. One afternoon, Eli was trying to explain the difficult, shifting sound of the letter R, and Lila was getting increasingly frustrated, confusing it with the letter D.
It's like the engine of the train. Lila, he tried. It's a growl. I can't growl it right,
she grumbled, rubbing out her 10th failed R with her thumb, leaving a gray smudge. Eli leaned back, tipping his hat forward over his eyes to filter the glare. Look, I told you, I'm the king of mistakes. One time, I was moving a delivery of patent medicine out of Santa Fe, and the merchant had the audacity to label a shipment of bitters, which tasted like mud and vinegar, as the famed elixir of youth. I read it as elixir of youth, and I was so convinced I was carrying a load of pure spring water that I told every drover it would make them young again. He shook his head, a wry grin lifting the corner of his mouth. Don't worry, the letters always tell the truth eventually, even if we read them wrong for a while. His self-effacing joke worked every time, easing the pressure and reminding her that even competence was built on a pile of past errors. The pencil stub became shorter each day, the lead wearing down under the insistent pressure of her learning. It was a tangible symbol of her advancement, a constant measure. She handled it carefully, tucking it back into her cloth pouch next to the unread letter when the sun dipped too low and Eli called the lesson finished. Eli enforced the boundaries rigidly. One day, a fierce wind kicked up, covering the porch in a thick, choking cloud of red dust. He grabbed the board and his supplies, gesturing for her to do the same. Too dangerous, he stated, his voice tight. We stop. Lila knew he meant the rule about moving the lesson indoors. She waited, expecting him to break and suggest moving inside the shed. But Eli simply packed his gear and walked toward the widow's cantina without another word, ending the lesson 10 minutes early, preserving the integrity of their agreement over the convenience of shelter. His respect was as important as the letters themselves. The moment of the day that brought the most profound feeling was the moment of writing. After recognizing a sound, Eli would have her practice the letter until her hand ached and the wood grain beneath the chalk dust was perfectly memorized. She practiced L, the start of her name, the anchor. She practiced I, the upright column of self. One evening, after she had successfully written the entire alphabet, albeit in clumsy, oversized letters, Eli stood watching her. She picked up the chalk, and without being prompted, she wrote the letter L. It was still shaky, but the lines were straight, the horizontal foot fixed firmly to the ground of the barrel. It was her L, solid and defined, standing up against the dust and the fading light. Eli simply nodded, satisfied, and she felt a powerful surge of accomplishment, a feeling deeper than the temporary relief of a clean plate or a paid debt. It was the feeling of knowing one small, true thing that no one, not even Silas Crowley, could take away from her. The letter L was hers, and it was the first step on a very long, dusty road to spelling the word forever. The initial hurdle of embarrassment had been cleared, replaced by the relentless, quiet work of memorization and phonics. Lila May, driven by the ticking clock of Crowley's fraudulent note, was a fierce student. She tackled consonants like knots in a rope, refusing to be defeated by the subtle differences between P and B, or the spitting sound of S. One afternoon, the lesson stalled. They were working on short vowel sounds, using a tattered geography book Eli had carried in his saddlebag. The book contained lists of state capitals, names meaningless to Lila, yet carrying the weight of faraway importance. She struggled with the simple, declarative shape of a word, unable to detach the letters from her own deep-seated sense of inadequacy. It is not clicking today, she confessed, her head lowered. It just looks like birds' feet scratched in the dust. And I am tired of knowing I am the only person in Red Butte who cannot read the bill of fare. Eli did not offer false comfort. He pushed the lesson book aside and retrieved 2 chipped tin mugs from his bag. He poured water, precious, slightly salty water from his canteen, offering one to Lila. The letters are just tools, Lila, like a good knife or a well-fitted bridle. They don't judge the hand that holds them. He paused, watching the dust motes dance in the late sunbeam. Tell me how you came to Red Butte. The whole story, if you can spare it. Lila took a long drink, gathering her courage. She spoke in low, disjointed pieces, the narrative of her life a familiar, dry ache. Her father had been a railroad laborer, often drunk, always moving. There had been no stability, which meant no school, not even for a day. Her mother had taught her simple numbers, how to count inventory, but not the alphabet. Mama died when I was 16, Lila recounted, her voice flat. She taught me everything else, how to keep clean, how to cook, how to keep a secret, but she never learned the letters either. She always said, Lila, child, never let anyone know they can fool you with paper, but she never told me how to stop them. After her mother was gone, Lila drifted, working odd jobs, often paid less because she could not verify the numbers written on the payslip. The shame of having to ask someone to read a simple sign or a legal notice was a constant companion, a burning brand on her dignity. The land, she finished softly. That's what Mama left me, just 40 acres. It was a promise of a home, a stake to keep, but without the letters, it is just a target painted on my back. Eli listened without interrupting, his face impassive but his eyes reflective. When she finished, he picked up a smooth piece of river stone and rubbed its surface with his thumb. My story is shorter, but it carries a longer shadow. He admitted, I was a courier, not a fighter. I carried the dispatches during the War of Secession. I could read and write faster than most officers could think. My job was to get the message through, no matter the cost. He stared off toward the western ridge, where the high desert started its ascent to the plains in the last years of the war. I was given an order to deliver, a set of movements, but I intercepted an earlier dispatch that contradicted the order. It would have led a whole company into a trap set by forces that were not officially recognized, and would have involved innocent people caught in the middle. I saw the names on the list. I knew the outcome. Eli's jaw tightened. I did not deliver the final order. I buried the dispatch, saved the company, and saved the civilians. When I returned, the silence was interpreted as cowardice, or perhaps treason. There was talk of a court-martial, but I rode out before the official papers were served. I was branded in whispers as a man who chose silence over duty, a coward who valued his own skin more than the chain of command. Lila watched him, understanding the nature of reputation in the West once written. A rumor was harder to erase than ink. The truth is, Eli continued, his voice barely a breath, I chose a different, quieter duty. But to this day, my papers are dirty. The irony is, I risked everything to save people from an unread death sentence. And my punishment was the stain of an unread reputation. I understand the power of the invisible word. Lila, I understand why we fight for the light of it. Their shared vulnerability, hers, the shame of ignorance, his, the burden of a false. Written history forged a profound, unspoken trust. Their relationship was built on the foundation of shared struggle, not superficial attraction. Just as the lessons settled into a routine, a new ripple of social conflict disturbed the dusty quiet of Red Butte. Miss Finch, a traveling schoolteacher, a woman built like a sturdy wagon and carrying a trunk full of primers, arrived in town. She saw Lila and Eli on the shed porch and, inspired by the small, private act of learning, decided to open a small literacy circle for women at the church hall. We need letters. We need to understand the documents that govern our lives, Miss Finch declared passionately outside the widow Alvarez's. She invited Lila to join, offering to teach a variety of skills, from cursive to basic arithmetic. Lila was conflicted, wanting the knowledge but terrified of public exposure. That evening, a group of ranchers and roughnecks were gathered outside the saloon, sipping beer and listening to the fiddle player. When Miss Finch's invitation was mentioned, the air filled with cynical jeers. "Women reading what for?" shouted a burly man named Jeb. "To read the label on the cough syrup, I suppose," another retorted, earning a roar of crude laughter. "Letters only cause trouble," a third voice declared. "The definitive judgment of a world resistant to change. They should stick to cooking and sewing. Reading gives them ideas, and ideas make them poor wives." Lila, scrubbing plates inside, felt the old, familiar humiliation burn her ears. The consensus of the town's men was a heavy, suffocating blanket of prejudice. Illiteracy was not just a state of being. It was a prescribed social role. Eli found her later, sitting on the steps, wiping down the last of the wooden spoons. "Don't let them get under your skin," he advised. "They fear what they cannot control, and a woman who can read the rules they want to keep hidden." He steered the conversation back to the practical. He had begun teaching her the alphabet of survival, the symbols used for branding cattle. She was learning that W could mean water, but W with a bar could mean W bar ranch, and the complex combination of lines and curves was a form of written identity. She learned to spot the difference between a freshly applied, true mark and a hastily altered, fraudulent one. This skill, this immediate applicability of letters to life, began to heal the shame. She could now look at the county records, which Eli had copied the simplified symbols from, and distinguish between the official county seal, which contained 3 specific stars, and the simplified, often poorly rendered marks used on hastily drawn-up notes of sale. This blending of practical survival skill with academic knowledge was a turning point. Eli taught her to read the stars in the night sky, using the Big Dipper and Polaris, the North Star, as navigation points. Letters in the sky, Eli murmured one cool evening as they sat on the porch. Long after the learning had finished, looking up at the vast Texas night, they never changed their meaning. They always point true north. Lila, in turn, worked on his gear, meticulously waxing his leather chaps and patching a tear in his heavy leather jacket. She found a small, hidden hole near the elbow and began to sew it with a careful, tight saddle stitch. "You're closing up your armor," Eli observed, watching her handiwork. "I am making sure the wind doesn't cut through," she countered, her needle flashing under the lamplight. She was starting to decode the world with the new sounds. One afternoon, while reading a list of words, she saw trail and pronounced it, with perfect phonetic accuracy, as trial. Eli's composure broke, and he laughed, a sudden, loud, genuine sound that surprised them both. "A trial. Lila, are you calling the cattle drive a test in court?" Lila May blushed, then laughed too. "It feels like a trial. Sometimes, all that heat and dust, but I see it now. The R comes before the A. Trail. Well, in this life," Eli admitted, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye, "the trail often is the trial. You aren't far off. Honestly." The tension broke the moment a local conflict boiled over. Voss, likely sent by Crowley, found Lila by the well, drawing a bucket of the precious hard-won water. "Still playing with the letters," Lila May Voss growled, stepping into her space. "You look like you need to focus on drawing water, not drawing words." He made a sudden, brutal move, kicking the bottom of her filled bucket. Water sloshed over the rim, soaking the ground and Lila's skirt. Lila gasped, not at the water, but at the deliberate, malicious cruelty of the act. She looked at Voss, anger finally replacing her fear. Eli, who had been watering his horse nearby, saw the incident. He moved, not with the quickness of a fighter, but with the measured pace of a man taking control of a situation. He did not touch Voss, did not throw a punch. Instead, he stopped directly between Voss and the spilled water. "Voss," Eli's voice was calm, but carried a dangerous edge of authority. "You're standing too close to the rail siding, and there's a sign." Voss scoffed. "What sign? McCrae, I don't see no." Eli pointed across the dusty yard, to a hastily hammered plank of wood near the train line. meant to ensure safety near the engines. On it was painted, in blocky, black letters, "No smoking within 50 feet. County ordinance." "It's a county ordinance," Eli repeated. "I need you to confirm that you have read that ordinance. Voss, read it out loud for the widow and the boys in the saloon so we know you are complying with the county law." Voss turned pale. He was a brute, but he was also illiterate, and he was being challenged to prove his legal standing in front of half a dozen people. He stammered, looking from the sign to the ground. "It just says words." Voss grunted, his confidence draining away. Eli smiled, a cold, thin expression of victory. "It says you're standing in violation of the rule. Voss, unless you can read it, you can't argue it. Perhaps you should ask the girl here to teach you how to spell ordinance so you don't violate the law." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the small crowd. Eli had defeated the brute not with muscle, but by exposing the very ignorance Voss and Crowley used as their primary tool. It was a precise, intelligent strike at his dignity. Voss, humiliated, stomped off toward the saloon, defeated not by a fist, but by 5 feet of painted words. Later that evening, Lila looked at Eli's tobacco pouch, the place where he had recorded the numbers from the fraudulent deed. She was learning to trace the numbers, and the tiny, penciled script on the pouch now felt less like a code and more like a map. "Where is that pin on the map you want to travel to?" Eli asked, as she helped him pack his supplies. Lila tapped a spot on the pouch, near the faintly drawn lines of Texas, the one where I am not afraid of the ink on the paper. She answered. She retrieved her slate, which Eli had given her, and meticulously copied a simple image Eli had drawn a dusty handprint over a clean white letter. It was the symbol of her struggle, the grit and grime of her daily life pressing down. Yet the knowledge, the clean, white truth of the letter, remaining solid beneath it. Meanwhile, behind the clean, pale hands of Silas Crowley, a cold determination was setting in. He heard the rumors of Lila May's lessons and the story of Voss's humiliation at the signpost. Crowley sat in his office, his pen scratching quietly over a ledger. He did not look angry, only calculated. "So, the little mouse is learning to read," he murmured to his deputy. "A nervous, quiet man. She wants to read her deed. Does she? Well, let her. It will do her good to read the eviction notice herself. I'll make sure the papers are perfectly legible." He allowed himself a brief, chilling smile. The law will still be the law, even if she can sound out the letters. The heat of the day was beginning to break, giving way to the gentle, elongated shadows of the late afternoon. The daily ritual on the shed porch had evolved from a tense, strictly business exchange into something bordering on companionship, threaded through with the quiet warmth of shared effort. Lila May was now tackling 3-letter words, learning to merge the separate sounds of the consonants and vowels into a single, cohesive noise, the essence of reading. To make the abstract shapes concrete, Eli had brought a pouch of dried pinto beans from the cantina's supply. The current lesson was on the word run. "The sounds are separate things," Eli instructed, demonstrating by sliding the beans apart on the wooden barrelhead, R-U-N. But when you push them together, they stop being beans and they start being the idea, the action. He gently nudged the beans together with his fingertip. Lila leaned over the barrel, concentrating, her brow furrowed. She slid them apart, R. A slight gap, U. Then the final bump, N. "Run," she sounded out carefully, trying to capture the quick, sharp sound. She was getting it right, but her effort was so intense that her face was strained. Eli watched her, knowing that while she could now shape the letters, the terror of error still held her back. He decided a diversion was in order. "Lila," he said, drawing her attention, "you have made a grievous error." She instantly stiffened, fear flashing in her eyes. "What did I break the rule?" "Worse," Eli said, his voice theatrically serious. "You failed to laugh at my earlier mistake, and the penance must be paid." Lila looked confused, then smiled faintly, remembering his old story. The Sarsapar Hilla. Precisely, he confirmed. For neglecting your duties as my apprentice in silliness, you must now spell sarsaparilla 3 times, entirely correctly, without the phantom H. Lila stared at the long, impossible chain of letters. Sarsaparilla. She stammered on the first try, missing a letter. Eli made a terrible, exaggerated sound of disappointment, slapping his hand over his forehead. You have doomed my drovers to 3 more years of mistaking bitters for tonic again, or I shall be forced to make you wear a sign that says Lila May, speller of faulty tonics. Lila started giggling, then laughing, the tension in her shoulders finally breaking. It was a genuine sound, light and clear, like water bubbling up through dry sand. She loved the dry, self-effacing humor he used to ease her way. It wasn't just a joke. It was a way of teaching her to be gentle with her own limitations. Sarsaparilla, she spelled, getting it right this time, the words sounding victorious and ridiculous all at once. Well done, Eli said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You have saved the thirsty men of the West. See, you can handle any word, even the foolish ones. The attraction between them was growing, not through physical closeness, which they scrupulously avoided, but through this shared humor and intellectual intimacy. It was a relationship built on respectful distance. One evening, a sudden cold snap dropped the temperature as the sun disappeared, bringing a chill wind howling off the Llano Estacado. Lila stayed on the porch late, finishing the repairs on a bridle. When she finally rose to leave, the air was suddenly sharp and cold, a shock after the desert heat. She was walking back toward the widow's small, attached room when she noticed something hanging on the back of the porch chair she had just vacated. It was Eli's heavy, well-lined canvas riding coat. Lila paused, confusion marking her face. Eli was nowhere in sight. He was likely inside the cantina, settling up with the widow. She knew he had not forgotten the coat. It was a necessary part of his trail gear. She looked at the coat, then at the shed door, and noticed a fresh, deep scratch on the wood, signifying a recent knocking. Eli had been there after she left, had placed the coat, and had then retreated. A moment later, a low, firm voice called from around the corner of the shed, where Eli had been tending to his horse. Good night, Lila. The wind picks up in the canyon. Be well. He had knocked to make sure she was safe and aware, left the coat outside for her use, and deliberately moved away so she wouldn't feel obligated or compromised by his presence. He wasn't looking to create a romantic moment. He was simply providing warmth with an unwavering respect for the boundaries they had established. It was a gesture of protection, not possession, and it warmed Lila more effectively than the heavy canvas ever could. This respectful attention defined their connection. Their intimacy existed in the small, non-physical exchanges when he handed her the chalk. His fingers would brush only the wooden casing, never her skin. The focus was always on the small, definite things, the placement of a hyphen, the careful loop of a handwritten A. One twilight, they were working with a fresh piece of rawhide, its surface smooth and pale. Eli was showing her how to use a needle to mark letters onto the leather, a skill vital for marking supplies on the trail. They were hunched over the barrel, pointing at the same spot. The air was still, broken only by the dry rasp of the wind blowing through a clump of cholla cactus nearby. It made a sound like a distant, quiet whisper. Listen, Eli murmured, raising his head slightly. That's the sound of the empty places, the quietest sound in the world. Lila listened, the feeling of the silence washing over her. She knew that sound, having spent many nights alone on her piece of land. Eli gently placed the heavy, brass-tipped point of the pencil stub back into her hand, settling her grip just so on the rawhide. There was no direct touch, only the transfer of the tool, but the shared focus, the warmth of the implement, and the knowledge that they were aligned on the same tiny crucial task, spoke volumes. Their eyes met over the barrel, and in the deepening dusk, words were unnecessary. The long, deep look, free of demands, filled the space between them. But the safe, warm cocoon of their lessons was always threatened by the harsh realities of Red Butte. One afternoon, Lila had to run a quick errand to the general store to buy salt for the widow Alvarez. As she passed the saloon, a group of ranchers spilled out, talking loudly. Among them was the man named Jeb, who still resented Miss Finch's attempts to start a women's literacy circle.
Look, there's the little reader, Jeb slurred. Spotting Lila, still trying to figure out if 2 and 2 make 4. Little heart.
He saw his chance to humiliate her publicly and undermine Eli's influence. He unfolded a piece of official-looking paper, likely a bogus land claim he'd bought off Crowley, and held it high. "This here," Jeb announced to the crowd, his voice booming with cruel sarcasm, "is a legal contract. It says Lila Mae Hart agrees to wash my socks for a year for 1 bottle of cheap whiskey. She put her mark on it right here. Folks," he pointed mockingly to an X, "can't deny what the paper says. Can you? Girl, a signed contract is a signed contract." The men roared with laughter. Lila felt the blood drain from her face, the familiar shame rising like bile. This was the terror of her old life, the fear that any piece of paper could ruin her, and she would have no defense. But she didn't run. She stood her ground, remembering the strength of the L she had written, and the cold logic of Eli's words. You can fight the man, but you cannot fight the paper. She didn't know enough to understand the document, but she knew enough to recognize the game. She remembered the sight of the county seal and the precise, upright letters Eli had taught her. She forced her voice to be steady. "Mr. Jeb," Lila said, her voice clear despite the tremor in her throat. "That paper is filthy, and the letters are written crooked. I have not read the entire document, but I can read the first line of the title. I can tell you that the spelling of Hart is not the way my mother wrote it, and I see a smudge where the county seal should be. You cannot shame me with a piece of paper I have not touched." She hadn't fought the idea of the contract, only the form. It was a small victory, but it was enough to stop the laughter. She hadn't needed to read every word. She only needed to recognize the flaw in the execution. Jeb, stunned by her unexpected resistance and knowledge, sputtered, folding the paper away quickly. Lila walked past them, head held high, the first small battle won by the strength of a few early, learned letters. This confrontation, though brief, reinforced a painful truth for Eli. He was seeing Lila's vulnerability and her fierce courage grow daily, yet his internal conflict persisted. He feared that by helping her win this immediate fight against Crowley, he was only delaying his inevitable need to ride away. His own past was a weight he had failed to protect those he cared for during the war, choosing to leave the mess behind him. He feared becoming the kind of man who rescued a person only to abandon them to the next danger. "I have to stay until she can stand on her own 2 feet, he promised himself grimly, watching her retreat. Until she has the letters to fight for herself, I will not leave her defenseless. Eli's personal promise dovetailed with a new concern in town. Deputy Tom, the tired, earnest deputy sheriff of Red Butte, who had a long-standing suspicion of Crowley's land maneuvers, approached Eli discreetly one morning. "Crowley's ledger work is too clean," McCrae, Deputy Tom admitted, chewing slowly on a piece of hay, "but the documents he files, they feel wrong. I think he's swapping pages in the old registry. But I can't read the cursive well enough to prove it. And I don't know the proper codes. You were a courier. You know how paper trails work." He handed Eli a worn, leather-bound notebook with meticulously copied notations of land sales. "Look through this. See if the numbers match the records he files next week. You're good with small numbers. Keep your eyes open on the paper trail." Eli now had a double mission, teaching Lila to read for her self-defense and quietly surveying Crowley's official paperwork for Deputy Tom. The stakes were rising, tying him more firmly to Red Butte than he had planned. The warm domesticity of their arrangement continued to counter the rising stakes. Lila would often wrap Eli's lunch fresh cornbread and dried meat in the daily newspaper that arrived on the train, a paper usually destined to light the widow's stove. One day, Eli unwrapped his bread and found the ink from the newspaper had bled slightly into the cornbread, leaving the print greasy and faint. Lila watched him carefully. Did the cornbread ruin the news? Eli picked up the paper, peering at a word blurred by butter. It just made the letters slide around a bit, he said, teasing. He looked at her and smiled. Perhaps the butter helps the words go down easier. Lila, the news is so dry these days. Maybe it needs a little grease to slip into the mind. Lila laughed, the little inside joke a comforting sound. The lesson that evening was the most important one yet. Eli wrote the separate letters on the barrelhead H-O-M-E. Sounds like H-O-M-E, Eli articulated, watching her face. A place you fight to keep. Try to write it. Lila, write the place you are fighting for. Lila grasped the pencil, her heart pounding with the simple, profound meaning of the word. She wrote the 4 letters, slow, painstaking, and true. H-O-M-E. She made the finally with a sense of immense pride, realizing she had spelled not just a word, but a concept, a future. She looked at the word, then at the dirt on her hands, and the dusty ground where her mother's land lay. The emotion was so strong, so overwhelming, that her eyes filled with sudden, hot tears. They were not tears of shame, but of triumph. She could write home, just as the sun touched the edge of the world, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and red. Eli saw a quick, nervous figure ride past the edge of the town, one of Crowley's men, heading north toward the Surveyor's Ridge. Eli's calm immediately broke. The rumor he had dismissed as saloon talk now felt too real. The railroad was looking to buy land on the fringes, and Lila's 40 acres sat right on the curve of the most likely route. Crowley wasn't just collecting a debt. He was clearing out smallholders before the big sale. The eviction needed to happen, and the paper needed to be signed over. Fast. Eli made a silent, concrete vow. We start reading that eviction notice tomorrow. Lila, we have no more time for simple words. The late summer was giving way to the dry, bright beginnings of autumn, and the town of Red Butte had prepared for its one major social event of the year, the annual Harvest Fair. It was a day of rare distraction, featuring dusty horse races, overcooked barbecue, and a collective pretense that the drought was not, in fact, choking the life out of everything. Miss Finch, the traveling schoolteacher, had seized the opportunity. She set up a small reading corner near the feed stalls, proclaiming it a sanctuary for the curious. Literacy is freedom, she announced, arranging her primers on a small folding table. Lila May had been reluctant to attend. The humiliation of her ignorance had been a public burden for too long, but Eli convinced her. Crowley uses the darkness of the law, he said that morning, polishing his spurs. We will meet him in the light of the town square. You don't have to read a whole book. Lila, just one sentence. The lesson had advanced from simple words to short, declarative sentences. Eli had focused on the phonetic patterns of older, more formal language that populated legal texts and religious works. Lila, wearing the only clean dress she owned, walked to Miss Finch's corner. The noise of the fair, the shouting of the hawkers, the laughter of the children, the distant bellow of a nervous bull created a nervous, chaotic backdrop. Miss Finch, beaming, handed Lila a small, worn hymnal. Just read the first verse of the 23rd Psalm. Dear, you know the sounds. Lila stood, the hymnal heavy and foreign in her hands. She could feel the eyes of the townsfolk, the men who had mocked her for her thumbprint, watching. She looked down at the familiar, flowing words, but this time, they did not look like birds' feet. They looked like sounds, locked in place. She began, her voice low at first, then finding its strength. The Lord is my shepherd. She read, slow and deliberate, sounding out each word. I shall not want. She paused,
took a breath, and read the next line. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." She stopped there, overwhelmed by the quiet power of the words she had just summoned from the page. The crowd around Miss Finch's corner had gone utterly silent. It was only for a few seconds the time it takes for a deep breath, but in Red Butte, seconds of silence were momentous. They had expected clumsiness, maybe a few embarrassed stumbles. Instead, they heard the clear, definite sound of a person claiming knowledge, using the language that had always been reserved for the powerful. Miss Finch began to clap loudly, shattering the silence, and a few of the women joined in. Lila felt a fierce, trembling pride. She had stepped out of the shadow, but the light only served to illuminate the lurking danger. The victory was short-lived. As the crowd dispersed, Silas Crowley emerged from the county building, looking impeccably starched and carrying a thick folder. He spotted Eli McCrae standing near the well, watching Lila's small triumph with a satisfied, possessive look. Crowley approached the center of the square, rapping his knuckles on the folder to draw attention. His voice was cold, carrying authority and menace in equal measure. "I hate to interrupt the poetry reading," Crowley said, his smile thin and unpleasant, "but the county business cannot wait for sentimentality." He unfurled a new, officially stamped document, displaying it for the benefit of the gathered townsfolk. Miss Lila May Hart, who is now learning to read, will be interested to see this. As per the conditional note she signed 30 days ago, the improvement fund payment is now overdue. He tapped a large, crimson county seal on the page. "I have duly filed an attachment with the district registrar. The debt is called in full, and the land, 40 acres, is now scheduled for public claim auction in 30 days, unless the full value of the debt, including penalties, is paid immediately." It was Crowley's sharp counterattack, timed perfectly to turn her moment of public triumph into public disaster. He was showing the town that while she might read simple words, the complicated words of the law still belonged to him. Lila felt the floor tilt beneath her. 30 days, the same length of time she had spent gaining her alphabet. Eli, already moving, stepped up, his composure instantly returning. He ignored Crowley and focused on the document, his eyes, trained by years of reading cryptic wartime telegrams and blurred trail maps, zeroed in on the official seal. Crowley held the paper up, a symbol of his absolute authority. "It is stamped with the full county seal. Mr. McCrae, there is no appeal." Eli leaned closer, his expression unreadable, and examined the deep impression of the wax and the ink. He had studied the county clerk's official stamps through Deputy Tom's notes. The official Red Butte seal, commissioned from Wichita in the early 1870s, featured 3 stars surrounding a stylized saguaro cactus, plus one tiny, almost invisible punctuation mark, a single period dot below the cactus base, marking a flaw in the original die. Eli looked, his gaze intense. His heart skipped a beat, but his face remained steady. "Mr. Crowley," Eli said, his voice low and dangerous. "The official seal of Red Butte County has a single, small dot below the saguaro cactus, a flaw in the original die, easily seen under a glass. Your seal, while impressive, appears to be missing that defining punctuation mark." It was the crucial twist. The seal did not match. A single missing dot, a punctuation mark, was the proof of forgery. Crowley had commissioned a stamp, but in the haste to collect the land, Voss's crude sources had missed the smallest detail. Crowley's pale face flushed crimson, a clear indication of his guilt. He was exposed, but he was not yet defeated. Before Eli could press the advantage, Voss burst from the saloon, a whirlwind of manufactured rage. He wasn't after Eli. He was after the evidence that had been accumulating for Deputy Tom. "That drover is a spy," Voss roared, pointing at Eli. "He was seen rifling through the old ledger files near the clerk's office last night. He stole county property." It was a brilliant, vicious distraction. Crowley's man, the nervous clerk, suddenly appeared and planted a thick, leather-bound ledger, dusty and clearly pilfered from the archives. directly inside Eli's saddlebag, which was draped over his horse nearby. There, the clerk stammered, pulling the ledger out and holding it up as evidence. The record book. He's a thief. The crowd instantly turned, drawn by the drama of violence and betrayal. Eli was cornered. If he fought, he confirmed their worst suspicions. If he ran, he left Lila defenseless. "I am innocent of theft," Eli declared, raising his hands, but his words were drowned out by the noise. Deputy Tom, caught between the power of the county clerk and the man he suspected was an ally, was forced to act. He reluctantly placed Eli under arrest for the theft of county records, leading him away toward the small, single-room lockup behind the courthouse. Lila stood alone in the center of the square, watching the only man who had ever offered her true help taken away in handcuffs. The shame of her illiteracy, which had been momentarily defeated by the 23rd Psalm, now returned with crushing force. The thought echoed hollowly in her mind. If I had known the letter sooner, Eli would not have been vulnerable. If I had known how to read that first fraudulent note, he wouldn't have had to involve himself. He wouldn't be in jail now. She looked at the paper that Crowley held the demand for her land and the blurry, red seal that Eli had pointed out. She had to understand it. She had to fight the paper, now more than ever, for herself and for him. Lila walked to the church hall, where Miss Finch was packing up her primers. "Miss Finch," Lila pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "I need to learn how a legal document is built. I need to know the parts, the structure, the rules of the paper, everything. I need to learn to read well enough to face Crowley in 30 days. Miss Finch looked at the young woman's fierce, desperate eyes and understood that the moment was now or never. "We will start tonight, Lila. We will not sleep until we know the shape of that debt." That night, the only light burning in the church hall was the faint, flickering glow of a single kerosene lamp. Lila and Miss Finch worked in silence. Lila copied the entire text of the fraudulent note, practicing the cursive script until her fingers were black with ink. She drew diagrams of the contract's structure, preamble, stipulation, penalty, seal. The pencil stub, which had been her constant companion, was replaced by a small, pointed quill pen. The pen scratched against the paper like a desperate insect. Her fingers, unused to the delicate pressure, ached with the labor. The symbols of her struggle were stark her fingers, stained black with ink, a visible sign of her painful, new literacy, and the lamp, burning low, the wick slowly being exhausted by the fierce need for light, the price of the knowledge she was trying to claim. Lila worked until the wick smoked and the oil was almost gone, and Miss Finch finally collapsed, exhausted. Lila returned to the cantina, the fraudulent paper clutched in her hand. She sat under the dim, distant light of the saloon, tracing the letters, forcing herself to recognize the words. She had learned enough now to decode the script. She read her name, Lilamaehart, and then she read the description of the debt. She realized, suddenly, something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the spelling of her own name on the land description. It wasn't just the missing dot on the seal. The name of the beneficiary, Lyle May Hart, had the letters subtly rearranged, the I and the Y swapped, the A in May replaced with a Y, and the T missing from Hart. It was a spelling so close to hers that any illiterate person would accept it, but just different enough to make the contract technically unenforceable against Lila May Hart of record. A cold, certain realization settled in her gut. This wasn't just debt. This was a sophisticated, total forgery, designed to trick the illiterate into signing over a document intended for a different, fictitious person. Lila May Hart, the girl who couldn't read, had learned enough to suspect that the entire debt note was a lie, and that her fight against Silas Crowley was now a fight for justice, not just land. She had read her first line of defense. The cold dawn found Lila May Hart standing outside the small, wooden lockup, where Eli McCrae was being held. Deputy Tom, looking rumpled and thoroughly miserable, was just bringing Eli a mug of weak, lukewarm coffee Lila waited until Deputy Tom, who was trying hard to avoid the glare of the county clerk's office, moved away. She approached the barred window of the cell. Eli was sitting on a thin cot, his shoulders slumped not in defeat, but in weary frustration. "They cannot prove I stole anything," Eli said, his voice flat. The clerk planted the ledger right as Voss made the accusation. "But the judge won't be in town for 10 days. And Crowley knows I can't clear my name until then. He's buying time to file his claim." "I know what he is buying time for," Lila responded, her eyes bright with a cold, fierce clarity. She pushed the crumpled fraudulent note against the bars. "He's buying time for me to forget how to read, but I won't." She told him about the missing dot on the seal and the deliberately wrong spelling of her name, Lyle May Hart. "It's a ghost name," Eli realized immediately, his eyes widening. "A straw man. If you had signed that name, they would have the land. But you only made your mark, thinking it was a receipt for Lila May Hart. The document is legally faulty, not because of the debt, but because it doesn't apply to the person of record." "But I need proof," Lila insisted. "I need the original county records to show the forgery, to show the real name. Deputy Tom has to help." Deputy Tom, who had been lingering nearby, reluctant to leave the two alone, sighed heavily. "Crowley has locked the main office," he whispered, leaning close to the bars, "but the old registry books and archives are kept in the shed out back, for fire safety. They are dusty, but they are there. I'll let you in after the saloon closes." That night, under the weak glow of the deputy's lantern, Lila and Deputy Tom entered the county's rickety storage shed. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and dust. They searched the chaotic stacks of records, looking for the old land register, the master book from the early 1880s that showed the true property owners, the true seals, and the true legal formatting of the era. After an hour of careful searching, Lila spotted it, a massive, leather-bound ledger, tucked beneath a pile of old survey maps. When they opened it, they found the terrible truth several pages near the beginning of the volume. Precisely where the land deeds for the fringe properties were recorded had been crudely cut out. He cut the pages. Deputy Tom swore under his breath. Horrified, he removed the original records to make his new, forged documents look authentic. "We don't have a base to compare." Lila, however, did not surrender to despair. Her hands, still bearing the faint smudge of ink from her previous night's writing practice, ran over the remaining pages. She was no longer just looking at letters. She was analyzing the handwriting. "Look at the script, Deputy," Lila urged, pointing to the original scribe's elegant, flowing cursive on a remaining page. "Look at this capital R. It's almost a complete circle, a very old-fashioned high loop. Now look at the few pages he left behind that reference other debts." She pulled out the fraudulent note from her pocket, unfolded it, and laid it next to the old ledger. "The name Crowley is written here in the old style on this fake note, but the rest of the script, the filling in of the dates and sums, it uses a new, flat style. And look at the capital R here, in the word Red Butte on the document. The letter R in the forgery was modern, blocky, and lacked the flourish of the old county scribe. The sudden realization hit them. Crowley or his men had copied the genuine old script for key elements like the county name to confuse the uninitiated, but had failed to maintain consistency throughout the document, resorting to their own, newer handwriting style to fill in the rest. It was a crucial, human error, visible only to a mind recently obsessed with the details of penmanship. Their search for material evidence was interrupted by a desperate knock on the shed door. Deputy Tom opened it slightly to find Mr. Liang, the cook for the railroad's temporary dining car, standing outside, pale and sweating. Mr. Liang spoke quickly, his voice tight with fear. He was leaving Red Butte with the morning train. "Voss came to my brother's print shop last week," Mr. Liang whispered. "Voss needed a small, fast press and some hard brass. Said he was printing supply orders for the Grazing Association. But my brother heard him talking about a new stamp for a land deal. Voss was using our portable press. the one we use for making temporary notices when we run out of official letterhead. Mr. Liang confirmed their worst suspicions. He was definitely making a stamp, a round one, with stars. They use it to print up those fake order of supply forms. It is near the old smithy, where Voss keeps his horses. Lila and Deputy Tom had the forensic evidence, the handwritten proof, and now, the key witness. But as Deputy Tom quickly scribbled the location down, the air outside grew suddenly turbulent. The wind, which had been merely chilly, rose to a terrifying, deafening pitch. "Storm coming," Deputy Tom shouted, battling the door as a massive, churning brown cloud rolled over the western ridge. It was a prairie dust storm, a true norther, and it descended upon the town with brutal, choking speed. Lila grabbed the 2 remaining key pages from the original ledger and thrust them into the canvas bag. As she did, the shed door, wrenched by the cyclonic wind, burst open. The storm filled the air with blinding grit, rattling the structure. "The documents," Deputy Tom yelled. He grabbed a heavy tarp and threw it over the entire stack of archives. Lila, acting purely on instinct, ran to the small stove area where the widow Alvarez stored kindling. She grabbed a small bucket of water and threw it over the remaining stacks of paper near the walls, hoping to weigh them down. The dust was suffocating, visibility dropping to 0. This was nature itself, reflecting the chaos of the legal mess. It was a fight for survival, literal and symbolic. They emerged from the shed just as the worst of the storm hit, gasping and covered in an almost volcanic layer of red dust. The town was completely obscured. The immediate relief of having the witness and the evidence was tempered by a new social barrier. Deputy Tom gathered a few of the more honest small landholders' men who had seen Crowley's methods before and brought them to the widow Alvarez's cantina. The widow, whose sense of justice was as tough as saddle leather, opened her doors. Ignoring the rules about after-hours operation, she prepared a communal table for a collective affidavit, an act of defiance against Crowley's power. "If Lila May is fighting him with a pencil," the widow declared, placing a large, clean sheet of paper on the table, "we will fight him with our names. He thrives on fear and isolation. We will be many." But the fear was deep-seated. Only 3 men, 2 small-scale ranchers and Mr. Liang, who desperately needed the protection of the community before his departure, nervously affixed their shaky signatures. The others, small shopkeepers and ranch hands, shook their heads, their eyes darting toward the courthouse. Crowley's power, the power to revoke licenses, impose spurious taxes, or even manufacture a crime, was a cold, tangible threat. Lila spent the rest of the night practicing her careful comparisons, her focus absolute. She copied the entire fraudulent note again, her fingers cramping with the effort, making side-by-side comparisons of the capital letters. She noticed the slight, nervous tremor in the forgery's penmanship, a lack of confidence that the original county scribe's hand never displayed. As the sun began to break through the residual dust, bathing the town in a strange, yellowish light, Lila walked back to the lockup. Deputy Tom was there, letting Eli out briefly to stretch his legs in the small, dusty yard behind the building. Eli was exhausted but clear-eyed. He saw the fire in Lila's eyes, but also the deep exhaustion etched on her face. "Lila, listen to me," Eli said, his voice low and intense through the bars. "If we fight this, Crowley will come after you. He'll charge you with fraud, with tampering with the records. You have the land and the knowledge. You are free. I am just one man in a jail cell. Don't risk your life and your land for me. You can still sell the land, pay the debt, and ride out." It was the ultimate test of his promise, his willingness to sacrifice himself for her safety. Lila looked at him, her expression soft but unyielding. She didn't touch the bars, keeping the physical boundary intact, but her gaze was intimate and resolute. "You taught me to write HOME, Lila said quietly. "You showed me how to fight the paper, and you taught me that the letters have consequences. I am not running. I learned the letters to save myself from ignorance, and now I use them to save the man who gave me the light. I will not be the woman who leaves a good man in the dark. I am fighting to save my home. And to save you, they are the same fight. Eli. It was her declaration of love, delivered not with passion, but with the measured certainty of a legal affidavit. She was using her hard-won literacy to affirm her deepest loyalty. Her symbolic resolve was evident in the saddle leather she presented to him during the few slow hours in the cantina. Lila had taken a long, continuous strip of raw hide and slowly, painstakingly, braided it into a flawless, unbreakable length of rein. The braiding was tight, purposeful, and self-generated, a symbol of her initiative and control. Eli took the reins from her hand. The leather was warm, strong, and entirely her own creation. He nodded, accepting the reins and the commitment they represented. Crowley, meanwhile, heard about the flurry of activity at the cantina and the movement of Deputy Tom. He moved quickly to counter the momentum. He sent a runner to the nearest circuit judge, announcing a special, urgent session to settle the land dispute. The notice was posted on the church door. The traveling court would hold its session immediately following the Sunday service 2 days away. Crowley had made his final move, setting the stage for a public confrontation. He was confident. Lila May Hart had learned to read a primer, but she was still just a girl facing a seasoned county clerk in a rigged court. Crowley intended to win the game of paper, no matter how many dots were missing from his seal. The decision had been made. The court session was set for Sunday, barely 48 hours away. Lila May had the strength of her newfound knowledge and the support of Deputy Tom and Miss Finch. But Crowley was not a man to rely on the fairness of the legal system. He relied on brute force and fear. That night, Lila could not sleep. She sat by the cantina window, going over the 3 remaining pages of the original land register, practicing the old county script. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness, the kind of heavy quiet that precedes violence. Just after midnight, she saw a flicker of orange light against the black horizon, out beyond the town limits, in the direction of the old archives shed. Her heart leaped into her throat. The evidence. Lila raced out the back door, slipping into the darkness. She ran towards Deputy Tom's office first, banging on the door until the tired man, who had finally fallen asleep on his cot, stumbled out, half-dressed. The shed. "The archives are burning," Lila gasped, pointing towards the growing, hungry glow on the low hill. They raced to the scene, Deputy Tom carrying a water bucket and a small axe. When they arrived, the rickety wooden shed, crammed with a century of paper, was already fully engulfed. Voss, standing nearby, watching the conflagration with a sneering satisfaction, saw them. He did not run, simply melted back into the shadows of the yucca plants. He had done his master's bidding. Deputy Tom threw the bucket of water in a desperate, futile gesture. The fire was too far gone. The original records. Deputy Tom choked, his voice thick with defeat and smoke. Crowley has burned the pages we cut out, and now he has burned the whole book. We have nothing left to compare the forgery to. Lila, nothing but your word. Lila stood, stunned. The pillars of their defense, the original handwriting, the authentic seals, the documents that proved the fraud were dissolving into ash and smoke. The fire was a final, brutal declaration of Crowley's power. She had to get closer. She crept around the side, coughing, ignoring Deputy Tom's warnings. The heat was immense. Suddenly, she remembered her cloth pouch, the pouch containing her mother's last, unread letter, which she had foolishly left hidden inside a loose floorboard of the shed, feeling it was the safest place in the small town. Driven by a desperate impulse, Lila plunged towards the single wall that had not yet collapsed, shielding her face with her arm. She found the loose board, ripped it up, and felt for the pouch. Her fingers closed around the familiar texture of the rough cloth. She pulled it free, just as the supporting beam above her head groaned and sent a shower of sparks and flaming debris over her. She stumbled out, falling to the dirt, the firelight casting grotesque shadows on the land. She had saved the pouch, but her left forearm was stinging with a painful, immediate burn. Lila sank onto the dusty ground, clutching the pouch to her chest. The heat of the fire was gone, replaced by the bitter cold of defeat. She was injured, and the evidence was gone. She untied the twine on the pouch with shaky hands. Now was the time. Now, facing total ruin, she finally had to know what her mother had written. The letter was singed around the edges, but the core script was intact. She unfolded it, her eyes swimming with tears and the fatigue of the long night. She forced herself to read, sounding out the familiar, formal letters that Eli had taught her, merging them into words that spoke with her mother's voice. It was a short message, a farewell, written with deep love. The final paragraph, the one her mother had clearly labored over, spoke directly to Lila's current battle. Daughter, never let any man or woman put their mark where your name should be. Learn the letters. Lila, learn them not for pride, but for defense. A daughter who cannot read or write is easily robbed of her own voice. Hold your ground, my sweet girl. You have the right to stand tall. Lila finished reading, the tears finally flowing freely down her smoke-smudged cheeks. She had risked the fire to save the paper, and the paper had spoken to her, giving her the strength she needed for the morning. She had not only saved the letter, she had finally saved the message. She realized the terrible weight of their situation. She hurried to the lockup, where Eli, alerted by Deputy Tom, was waiting, his face grave. The shed is gone, Lila whispered through the bars, leaning her head against the cold iron. The evidence is ash. If I lose the court session tomorrow, I lose the land. And if I lose the land, Crowley has the power to keep you in jail for months, tied up in the paperwork for the theft of a book that doesn't exist anymore. Lila's voice cracked. If I lose my home, and you lose your freedom. Eli reached out and pressed his fingers gently against the cold iron of the bar closest to her burned arm. He could not touch her, but the closeness of his presence was a steadying force. Lila, I have to tell you the rest of the truth, Eli confessed, the decision made in the quiet, dark moment. My reputation for leaving the war was only half the story. I did not just evade a court-martial, I ran from it. I should have gone back and defended my actions. But I was so disgusted by the lack of humanity in the orders that I ran to save the civilians caught in the crossfire. The cost was my honor. Written on a piece of paper I never signed, I chose a clear conscience over a clean record. He paused, gathering the rest of his confession. That record, the rumor of my cowardice, that is what Crowley is really using. He wants to discredit any testimony I might give, even if I was free. He wants to prove that I'm a drifter and a liar, and that your defense is just a ploy to cover my thieving. Eli spoke with absolute honesty, revealing the black spot on his past that had kept him a restless traveler for years. He laid his entire life, the good and the bad, at her feet, offering it up without demanding anything in return. I am not asking you to love me, Lila, he said simply, his blue eyes holding her gaze in the darkness. I am only asking you not to sell yourself short because of fear. I don't care if I spend a month in jail. But if you walk into that courthouse tomorrow and lose your self-respect by compromising with that thief, that will be the real loss. You have the truth in your heart. Don't let him write your ending. Lila stood silent, processing his brutal, honest admission and his simple, profound request. He wasn't asking her to fight for him. He was asking her to fight for her own integrity. He was giving her the choice to determine her own destiny. She looked at the fresh burn on her forearm, the painful, tangible cost of her pursuit of knowledge, and nodded. I won't sell myself, she promised, her voice clear and strong. Eli nodded, relieved. He pulled a small, folded cloth from his pocket, a handkerchief, carefully laundered. He reached the cloth out through the bars. I was practicing, he mumbled, a flicker of rare, genuine embarrassment crossing his face. Before the arrest. for when you had a name tag or something. Lila unfolded the cloth, stitched clumsily in bright red thread. On the corner of the white handkerchief was a capital L. It was crooked, the thread uneven. Clearly the work of a man whose hands were built for a bridle and not a needle. Lila felt a sudden, fierce urge to cry, but instead she laughed a soft, wet, necessary sound that broke the tension of the long, dark night. The sight of the strong, capable drover fumbling with embroidery to honor her name was a powerful, beautiful image of hope.
"It's a terrible L,"
she managed, wiping her eyes. "It is," Eli agreed, a soft smile on his lips. "But it's mine. Use it to wrap your burn." Lila carefully tied the handkerchief around her arm, the warmth of the cloth and the sincerity of the gesture seeping into her skin. She walked back to the cantina, the night air quiet, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the fading sizzle of the fire's embers. She sat down at her simple table, pulled out the ink Eli had given her, and dipped the new quill pen he had lent her. Her fingers, still stinging from the burn and the intense practice, were steady. She wrote the words on a clean sheet of ledger paper. Lila May Hart. She wrote it completely, fully, in the formal, upright script Miss Finch had taught her. No thumbprint, no nervous scrawl, but definite, solid ink. It was the first time she had written her full name as a declarative statement, an affirmation of self in the face of annihilation. Her decision was solidified. She found Miss Finch, who had finally gone to sleep on a cot in the back of the church hall, and woke her. "I will defend myself in court tomorrow." "Miss Finch," Lila stated, her voice calm, "I have the knowledge, and I have the original note. You will be my illiteracy advisor. You will hold the books and tell me if the legal language is correct. Deputy Tom will secure Mr. Liang as a material witness. We will win this with letters." Miss Finch, startled awake, saw the determined light in Lila's eyes. She nodded slowly. Lila then walked over to Deputy Tom, who was still standing guard over Eli. "Tomorrow, bring Eli McCrae from his cell," she commanded, not asking. "He will stand as a material witness to the fraudulent documents and the burn scars on my arm. Crowley thinks I am only learning to read the labels. Tomorrow, I will read the law back to him." The air on Sunday afternoon was thick and stifling, the dust from the previous night's fire still hanging heavy, coating the town in a fine, acrid layer. The traveling circuit judge, a stern-faced man named Judge Alistair, arrived promptly after the meager church service, setting up the court of inquiry on the wide, elevated porch of the Red Butte Church. It was a stark, open-air courtroom. Crowley stood to one side, immaculately dressed in a dark suit, holding the forged note like a sacred text. He was flanked by Voss, whose presence was a silent, brutish threat. To the other side stood Lila May Hart, her shoulders straight, wearing her best calico and a fierce determination. Eli McCrae, brought from the lockup by a reluctant Deputy Tom, stood slightly behind Lila, technically still under temporary arrest, serving as a material witness to the alleged theft of the ledger. The judge sat at a small table, a heavy book of statutes open before him, squinting slightly in the harsh glare of the Texas sun. The townsfolk gathered in a semicircle, silent and tense, knowing this was a final reckoning not just for Lila, but for the balance of power in Red Butte. Crowley began, his voice smooth and persuasive, detailing Lila's past failure to pay the water levy, the subsequent signing of the conditional debt note, and the due date that had passed. The defendant, Miss Hart, who only recently decided to take up rudimentary reading, claims fraud, Crowley stated, condescendingly, but the document bears the mark of the county clerk's office and was signed, or rather, marked by the defendant herself. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to evade a legitimate lien, fueled by the accused thief, Mr. McCrae, who is trying to disrupt legitimate county business. Judge Alistair looked at Lila. "Miss Hart, do you have a solicitor?" or someone to speak on your behalf. Lila stepped forward, her movement precise and unhurried. The white cloth, the handkerchief Eli had embroidered with the clumsy L, was tied around her burned forearm, a visual testament to the pain and the cost of her learning. Her voice, though trembling slightly at the start, grew clear and strong. "Your Honor, I will speak for myself. I have no lawyer, but I have a witness to the truth, and I have the evidence of the document itself." She faced Crowley directly. "I am here today not just to protect my land, but to charge Mr. Crowley with exploiting the illiteracy of the people of this county for his personal gain." She held up the forged note. "I can now read the words on this page. Your Honor, and the letters tell a lie so small it was designed to slip past the honest eye." She began to read the formal legal description of the property owner, enunciating each letter carefully. Lyle May Hart. "The land is to be held by Lyle May Hart." "That is not my name, Your Honor," Lila declared, her voice ringing out clearly. "My name is Lila May Hart. That is a fraudulent name, specifically designed with incorrect letters to confuse a person who cannot read. They substituted an Y for the I and Y for the A, creating a ghost name that cannot be proven to exist in the county records. I was coerced into marking this document, believing it was a receipt for my water use. The land ownership is under the name Lila May Hart. This lien is against a non-existent person." Crowley bristled, his calm demeanor fracturing. "Absurd. A simple clerical error. Your Honor, the general intent is clear, and the thumbprint is hers." "The intent is theft," Lila shot back, "and the seal is also a lie." She requested Miss Finch to step forward. Miss Finch, serving as her literacy consultant, presented a meticulously copied drawing of the original Red Butte County seal, taken from a book of county directives. "Your Honor," Miss Finch stated, pointing to the drawing, "the legitimate county seal, as defined in the 1872 charter, includes a small, differentiating dot beneath the saguaro cactus. This dot is missing from the seal on Mr. Crowley's document." Deputy Tom then stepped forward, looking relieved to finally act on his conscience. He placed a small, crudely carved block of brass, the partial mold of a stamp, on the judge's table. "This was recovered this morning near an old smithy, Your Honor," Deputy Tom announced. "It's the partial die used to create a non-official county seal." Suddenly, the last piece of the puzzle walked forward Mr. Liang, the railroad cook, who had delayed his departure for the trial. Mr. Liang, though nervous, confirmed in clear, steady English that he had seen Voss operating a small press and making a round stamp die at the smithy, ostensibly for supply orders. Crowley erupted, his authority crumbling. "This is a conspiracy, a pack of lies designed by a disgruntled High Plains thief and a kitchen girl who learned her ABCs yesterday. Her testimony is unreliable. And where is the original ledger, Your Honor? The one that would prove the discrepancy in the R handwriting. It has gone stolen by McCrae, the very man who stands behind her." Lila turned and faced Crowley, her expression fierce. "The original ledger is gone, Mr. Crowley, because your man, Voss, burned the archives shed last night to destroy the evidence. The fire burned the original records, but it did not burn my mother's final letter." She held up the singed letter, the small cloth pouch still tied to her injured arm. The entire square fell silent, anticipating the raw, personal truth. "Mr. Crowley dismisses me as a girl who only learned to read yesterday," Lila said, her voice dropping to a powerful, controlled whisper. "He believes a woman's word and a woman's writing is worthless. But my mother, who died illiterate, told me the truth of this world, and I will read it aloud now, so that every person here knows the true cost of ignorance." She read the final paragraph of her mother's letter, the words resounding with prophetic wisdom. "Daughter, never let any man or woman put their mark where your name should be. Learn the letters. Lila, learn them not for pride, but for defense. A daughter who cannot read or write is easily robbed of her own voice. Hold your ground, my sweet girl. You have the right to stand tall." The effect was devastating. The crowd, which had been wary and cynical, now saw the raw human cost of the county clerk's machinations. The justice system was supposed to protect the weak, and Crowley was systematically using it to prey on them. Just as the judge began to collect the affidavits, a sudden, powerful gust of wind, a localized swirl of the residual storm dust, enveloped the church porch. The thick, reddish dust whirled around them, obscuring vision, making the air gritty and impossible to breathe. The canvas awning covering the porch tore, and the whole temporary courtroom threatened to collapse. Eli, reacting instantly despite his bound hands, lunged and braced his shoulder against a weakening support column of the porch, holding the entire structure steady against the sudden, violent force of the wind. Lila, covered in the swirling dust, did not stop. She stood firm, her handkerchief-clad arm pressed against her chest, holding the note steady, and finished her final argument, her voice now shouting to be heard over the howl of the wind. It was a raw, visceral image of survival. She pointed at Crowley, who was cowering and coughing in the blast. "He wants the land. Your Honor, because the railroad is coming, he needs the small plots cleared so he can sell them as one large property. This is not about a debt. It is about conspiracy and greed." When the wind finally subsided, the porch remained standing, held up by Eli's strength and the truth, forced out by Lila's determination. Judge Allister, visibly shaken but entirely convinced, surveyed the scene, the man holding the structure, the woman holding the note, and the panicked, guilty look on Crowley's face. "The evidence presented, Miss Hart, proves conclusively that the document is fatally flawed," Judge Allister declared, his voice decisive. "The seal is fraudulent. The named lien holder does not match the party of record, and the original records have been destroyed under highly suspicious circumstances. I find in favor of Miss Lila May Hart." He struck the table with his gavel. "The debt note is null and void. The claim against Miss Hart's land is dismissed." Crowley turned purple with rage. Before he could protest, the judge continued, his gaze shifting to Eli. "As the stolen ledger has been rendered null by its destruction, and its theft was clearly staged by an employee of the county clerk, I find no material evidence to hold Mr. McCrae. He is to be released immediately." As Deputy Tom stepped forward to unlock Eli's cuffs, Voss, recognizing the collapse of his master's scheme, made a desperate lunge towards the table to snatch the fraudulent note and the brass die. Eli, even with the cuffs half opened, reacted with lightning speed. He shoved the judge and the table out of the way, throwing his weight against Voss. Deputy Tom joined the fray, and together, the two men subdued the brute, pinning him to the dusty ground. Lila, seeing the chaos, did not stop. She stepped up to the table, reading from the copy of the county code she had studied all night. "Your Honor," Lila cried out, her voice still ringing with authority, "I request the court to read into the record the clause for the protection of property from malicious damage and fraud. The land is secure, but the attempt must carry consequence." Her legal accuracy, her mastery of the very language that had been used against her, was the final, devastating blow. Judge Allister, impressed, nodded and ordered the immediate temporary suspension of Silas Crowley from all county clerk duties, pending a full federal investigation into the falsification of the county registry. The crowd, which had been silent for fear, now erupted in murmurs of agreement. The high climax had passed. The late afternoon sun, now dipping low, cast long, triumphant shadows across the porch. Eli stood free, rubbing his wrists, watching Lila. Lila May Hart, the former illiterate laundress, stood in the dust and the fading sunlight, entirely out of Crowley's shadow. She was burned, she was dust-covered, but she was straight and proud, standing as solitary and unconquerable as the yucca plant on her 40 acres of land. Justice had arrived, carried not by a gun, but by the power of a single, hard-won letter. The collapse of Silas Crowley's scheme sent a cleansing wave through Red Butte, much needed after the choking dust and the stench of corruption. Judge Allister's swift decision, driven by Lila May's precise, documented truth, had immediate and sweeping consequences. Crowley was officially suspended from his county clerk duties, pending a full federal inquiry into the falsification of the registry and the burning of the archives. He was now confined to his home, facing the imminent arrival of federal marshals. Voss, the heavy-handed brute, was locked in the same small cell Eli had occupied, charged with arson and assault. The power of the paper, once wielded so brutally by Crowley, was now turning against him, line by legal line. With the central threat removed, the community began a slow, necessary process of healing. Deputy Tom, suddenly relieved of the burden of covering up for his powerful boss, threw himself into the tedious work of re-establishing the land records, using Lila's meticulously copied notes and the few pages she had saved as his foundation. He finally secured the safety of the county registry, placing the original land book, now missing its central pages, in the vault of the railway office until a permanent fireproof storage could be secured. The most visible sign of community awakening was at the well. Lila, armed with a fresh piece of lumber and a can of black paint, worked slowly, concentrating on each letter. When she was finished, a new sign stood where the old fee schedule had been. It read, "Water free and fair." Below it, she painted a simple notice, offering to help anyone verify their land titles with Deputy Tom. It was the first time Lila had seen her literacy used not for personal defense, but for public justice. And the feeling was profound. The success in court had a ripple effect throughout the town. Miss Finch, energized by Lila's victory, announced the formal start of her night school. To everyone's surprise, several of the men from the saloon, including Jeb and a few others who had mocked Lila, began showing up, sheepish and unsure. They didn't want to read poetry, they just wanted to know how to sign their own names properly on a bill of sale. Fearing another Crowley might surface, they were afraid of paper, and now they knew the cure. Eli McCrae, now free, did not immediately ride out. He felt tethered to Red Butte by the promise he had made, but also by the quiet, deep bond he shared with Lila. His days were spent returning to the practical rhythms of the West. Only now, he used his hands to build, not just to survive. He organized the local men to dig a deep, protective ditch around the widow Alvarez's hay shed. And more importantly, he helped Lila run a small irrigation channel from a seldom-used, cleaner spring pipe that ran past her property line. He worked tirelessly, helping her safeguard her 40 acres. Lila, in turn, began planting. She worked the dry, packed earth, planting hardy yucca and prickly pear cactus plants that could withstand the heat and drought, plants that rooted deep, more deliberately. Around the rock boundary markers of her land, she scattered tiny, hard bluebonnet seeds, the state flower of Texas. They were symbols of hope, tough and beautiful. And when they bloomed, the thin blue line would mark her boundary, a living, vibrant line, like the blue ink on a protected book. The practical work of survival and the slow, careful cultivation of trust became the center of their days. Lila still felt a deep shyness around the general townspeople. Her past vulnerability had been too public. She often avoided the main street and kept her head down when walking through the cantina. But there was a difference now, a subtle, profound change. When she handled the new document, Deputy Tom gave her the official, correct deed to her land. Her hands did not tremble. They were steady and certain. She could read every word of the document, and the letters now offered assurance, not threat. The psychological shift was mirrored in a moment of unexpected, shared laughter during one of Miss Finch's night classes. Eli, still attending to offer simple arithmetic and map reading to the men, was explaining the difficulty of phonetic English. "I spent too many years talking to horses, not people," Eli declared, rubbing his chin. "And every time I try to say the word sarsaparilla without the phantom H, I fail." He mispronounced it again, drawing out the silly, incorrect sound. The rough men in the back of the room roared with laughter. It was an honest, cleansing sound. Eli caught Lila's eye across the room, and he winked. A brief, genuine spark of shared intimacy. "You see, Gentleman," Eli addressed the class, "I taught Lila to read the letters, but the letters teach me humility. I learn from her every day. The letters are our common ground." The slow dance of their attraction continued to honor the careful boundaries they had set. One evening, a massive, late-season thunderstorm rolled in, breaking the drought with a terrifying, glorious violence. Lila was caught outside the shed, gathering up the remaining tools. Eli found her there, the rain soaking his hat and jacket instantly. They stood together under the small, narrow overhang of the porch. The air filled with the smell of wet dust and lightning struck ozone. The sound of the rain was deafening, turning the street into a flash river of red mud. Eli was explaining a complex sentence in one of Miss Finch's primers, a passage about the rule of law. He pointed to a phrase, his finger drawing a line beneath the words on the slick, rain-spattered page. "Here," Eli said, his voice deep and close, trying to be heard over the storm. "This word, immutable. It means it cannot be changed." As he pointed, his finger momentarily, gently brushed the back of Lila's hand. It was the first time they had truly touched a quick, unintended contact, but significant in its context. Lila did not pull away. Her heart leaped, a sudden, warm movement in her chest. She held her ground, accepting the contact as a natural extension of their work, their shared focus on the truth of the letters. The line, once so rigidly held, had softly, naturally moved inward. The townsfolk, who had once sneered at Lila, now treated her with a new, deep respect. She was not just the girl who scrubbed dishes. She was the woman who had defeated Silas Crowley. The widow Alvarez, whose tough heart was rarely swayed, often smiled when she saw Lila writing out the menu or organizing the supply ledgers. "You've lost the rag, Senorita Letters," the widow teased one morning, using the affectionate nickname, "You are too busy with the pen to scrub the floor, right?" Lila simply smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her tired eyes. She was no longer Lila May, the illiterate orphan. She was Senorita Letters, the custodian of her own story. Eli, meanwhile, had been preparing. He spent his evenings carving a small object in the corner of the hay shed. He was not a gifted artisan, but his hands were strong and precise. He whittled a piece of smooth, dark walnut until it formed a small, rectangular box. Inside, he meticulously lined the box with a soft piece of velvet he had traded for at the general store. He placed the final items inside the new, beautiful quill pen he had gifted her, and a small glass bottle of deep blue, permanent ink. It was the only gift she would truly need, the power to write her own future. He closed the lid, the box smooth and heavy in his hand. He knew the time for the trail was coming, but he wouldn't leave Red Butte without making one final, complete declaration, the final lesson, the one that would last forever. The sun was beginning its slow, gracious descent, filtering through the high air with a mild, golden light. It was the hour when the relentless heat of the west finally softened, inviting quiet contemplation. Eli McCrae found Lila May near the farthest boundary markers of her land. It was a barren stretch of ground, still recovering from the drought, but around the rough stone markers, the bluebonnet seeds Lila had sown had sprouted, forming a thin, promising line of green along the edge of the dust. Eli dismounted, tethering his horse a respectful distance away. He was carrying the small, carved walnut box. He did not speak immediately. He took a heavy piece of canvas from his saddlebag, spread it over a patch of the freshest bluebonnet growth, and invited Lila to sit. She sat down, her hands resting lightly on the new growth, her face open and expectant. Eli placed the walnut box on the canvas between them. The gesture was solemn, yet intimate. "I have one final lesson for you, Lila," he said, his voice deep and warm, the most important word of all. Lila reached out, her fingers tracing the smooth, dark wood of the box. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on the velvet lining, were the new quill pen and the small bottle of permanent blue ink, tools of her sovereignty. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with understanding and gratitude. Eli took the quill pen, dipped it carefully into the ink, and held it steady over a clean, white sheet of paper he had placed on the box lid. He began to write, his hand moving with the familiar precision she knew so well. He started with a capital letter, large and bold, then followed with the rest, slow and deliberate, enunciating each sound as he wrote. F, he began, drawing the strong vertical line and the two arms of definition, O, R, E, V, E, R. He finished the word, laying the pen down, F-O-R-E-V-R. He looked at the word, then at Lila. His gaze held a lifetime of quiet journeys, hard choices, and now, simple commitment. They used to call me a courier. Lila, Eli said, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. I delivered the written message, but the greatest message I have learned to deliver is not written in the dispatches of the war or the ledgers of the law. He rested his hand on the box. She couldn't read or write until he taught her letters that spelled forever. That is how they will tell our story, if they ever do. But I was only the lamplighter. Lila, you found the path of the letters yourself, and you used them to save your land, and to save my honor. You own the word, not me. Lila looked at the word forever. It was not a magical charm. It was a promise, built with the same logical, definite structure as the word home. It was the strongest word she had ever encountered. She reached for the quill pen, her fingers stained with the ink of yesterday's struggle, now steady. She carefully traced the letters, sounding them out, tasting the meaning with each shape, F-O-R-E-V-E-R. Her hand did not shake. The shame was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. Eli watched her, her concentration absolute. He saw the transition, the last vestige of the terrified, illiterate girl disappearing, leaving only the capable, self-possessed woman. He did not kneel in a grand, theatrical gesture. He simply reached out and gently took her hand, the movement firm and respectful. Lila May Hart, Eli said, his voice perfectly clear, rooted in the earth and the truth between them. I don't want to be the wall you lean on for shelter. I want to be the gate you open for yourself. I want to be your home, built on a foundation of trust and common ground, where no contract can ever fool you again. He looked into her eyes, which were wet with unshed tears, but shining with fierce joy. Will you marry me? Lila could have spoken 1,000 words. She had learned to debate a county clerk, to read a legal affidavit, and to defend a fugitive, but she chose the purest, simplest expression of her decision. She picked up the quill pen, dipped it in the blue ink, and directly beneath the word Eli had written, she wrote one single, bold, declarative word, yes. Eli smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He gently brought her into a careful embrace, his arms strong and protective around her shoulders. It was a kiss shared not with passion, but with the slow, deep respect of two souls who had fought for the right to stand together. From far across the prairie, a few distant drovers, recognizing the shape of the embrace, let out a long, teasing whistle, but both Lila and Eli only laughed, the sound warm and shared in the fading light. The core of their story was illuminated fully, now love had not saved Lila. Education and her fierce pursuit of justice had. Their union was a promise of shared sovereignty, a bond as durable and enduring as the stone boundary markers of her 40 acres. The quill pen rested in Lila's hands, a symbol of her continued strength. The land behind them, now safe, was fringed with the hopeful, tenacious green of the bluebonnets. Even the wind, blowing past the rebuilt sign at the well, sounded like the satisfying rustle of a newly turned page. Lila looked back at her small, humble home, then at Eli. then at the pen in her hand. That very evening, she began her new community duty. Lila May, the Senorita Letters, opened the first of her own night classes, focusing on the women who were too afraid to attend Miss Finch's sessions. She did not teach poetry, only the basics of survival. "We learn these letters," Lila told them, her voice confident, so that no one ever has to put their thumbprint onto their own ruin again. That night, under the soft glow of her own lantern, Lila May Hart, a free woman with a future and a name, walked out to her gate. She picked up a piece of charcoal and, in firm, definite strokes, wrote her full name and Eli's on the wooden post, proclaiming their union to the world. She wrote Lila May Hart and Eli McCrae. The next morning, the sun rose, reading their names, bold and clear, across the horizon. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts on Lila and Eli's journey. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Night channel. Like this video and hit the hype button so more people can discover this story of love and literacy.